Welcome to Biden Brief. The content of the briefing includes: Israel latest, more aid trickles into Gaza as death toll rises. Israel's dilemma, how hostage talks could bog down military plans. U.S. says it will retaliate if American forces are attacked in Middle East. Blinken, Austin say U.S. is ready to respond if U.S. personnel become targets of Israel-Hamas war. U.S. China visits put Australian PM's diplomatic skills to test. Israel latest, more aid trickles into Gaza as death toll rises. Yahoo! The timing of any ground invasion into Gaza remained uncertain on Sunday. Israel's support for diplomatic efforts to release hostages may delay or alter the plans, people familiar said, even as the Israeli military steps up air raids in preparation for the next phase of the war. Israel's dilemma, how hostage talks could bog down military plans. Wall Street Journal. Israel faces a difficult decision as it contemplates the next stage of its war in Gaza. If it continues to engage in indirect negotiations with Hamas regarding the fate of over 200 hostages, Israel risks becoming bogged down in talks with a group it has promised to destroy. However, if it proceeds with a ground operation before the hostages are released, Israel risks higher casualties and increased international pressure to limit its operations. Furthermore, a large-scale invasion of Gaza could result in a second front if Hezbollah attacks while Israel is engaged against Hamas. The risk posed by Hezbollah is so great that some have suggested Israel should launch a preemptive strike across its northern border to destroy some of Hezbollah's missile capabilities. Israel has called up roughly 360,000 military reservists in preparation for the next phase in Gaza. The ground offensive will focus on targeting Hamas fighters and leaders who use tunnels and fortified bunkers to evade Israeli forces. Israel is facing pressure from the U.S. and other countries to delay the invasion to allow negotiations to continue for the release of the hostages and to allow humanitarian aid to enter Gaza. U.S. says it will retaliate if American forces are attacked in Middle East. Al Jazeera. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has warned that the U.S. is prepared to retaliate if American troops are targeted in the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. Blinken stated that the war is likely to escalate through the involvement of Iranian proxies, and that the Biden administration is ready to respond if U.S. personnel are attacked. He also revealed that Israel does not want to govern the Gaza Strip after the conflict ends. However, he stressed that there can be no return to the previous status quo, and that a solution must be found to prevent future attacks from Hamas. The Israeli army has been bombing Hamas targets in Gaza since October 7, and it is unclear what Israel's plan is for the post-offensive period. U.S. President Joe Biden has spoken with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to discuss the situation, and also had a call with Pope Francis. Blinken, Austin say U.S. is ready to respond if U.S. personnel become targets of Israel-Hamas war. The Independent. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has warned of potential escalation in the Israel-Hamas conflict, saying that the Biden administration is prepared to respond if American personnel or armed forces become the target of any hostilities. Blinken stated that the U.S. does not want escalation and hopes to avoid its forces coming under fire, but is ready to respond if necessary. His warning comes as Israel's military response to a deadly Hamas attack entered its third week, with Israeli warplanes striking targets in Gaza, Syria, and the occupied West Bank. The U.S. has also announced that non-essential staff at its embassy in Iraq should leave the country. Blinken recently visited the region and spoke of a likelihood of escalation by Iranian proxies directed against U.S. forces. U.S. China visits put Australian PM's diplomatic skills to test. Bloomberg. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese will travel to the U.S., China, and the Cook Islands in a series of diplomatic engagements. He will meet with President Joe Biden and attend a state dinner in Washington, becoming only the fourth Australian leader to receive such an honor. The visit to China will be the first by an Australian leader in 7 years, and will include meetings with President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Qiang. The trip aims to strengthen Australia's alliance with the US and improve relations with China. Tim Scott defends saying Biden has blood on his hands in wake of Hamas attack. Yahoo! Senator Tim Scott, Republican South Carolina, defended his previous comments where he alleged that President Biden has blood on his hands in the wake of Hamas's deadly attacks on Israel, claiming he does not regret the comment squared at the White House's prisoner swap with Iran last month. Hezbollah steps up attacks, IDF says, amid fears of wider conflict. Washington Post. There are rising concerns that the conflict between Israel and Gaza could escalate into a wider war, as Israel launches airstrikes across the region, and Hezbollah militants in Lebanon attack the Israeli north. This comes as the United Nations calls for more aid to Gaza, after 42% of Gaza's housing units have been destroyed or damaged, and 1.4 million people have been internally displaced. Israel has cut access to water, power and fuel for the Strip, leading to contaminated water, reports of diarrhea, and people drinking saline water from agricultural wells. The United States has announced it will send additional air defense systems to the Middle East and move the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower aircraft carrier strike group to the Persian Gulf. Meanwhile, Israeli strikes have hit schools, homes and churches in Gaza, with over 4,651 people killed in the Strip. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency has said 29 of its colleagues in Gaza have been killed since October 7. McConnell calls China, Russia, Iran new axis of evil that U.S. must deal with. This is an emergency. Yahoo! U.S. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has described China, Russia, and Iran as the new axis of evil amid conflicts in Ukraine and Israel. McConnell, the highest-ranking Senate Republican, spoke to Fox News about the Biden administration's approach to the $1.5 trillion deficit. He criticized the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and argued that this gave Russia the green light to invade Ukraine. McConnell also claimed that China's stance on the Israel-Hamas conflict suggested that this was a worldwide problem. Biden walks a tightrope with his support for Israel, as his party's left urges restraint. The Toronto Star. President Joe Biden is facing the difficult task of supporting Israel, while also pushing for restraint in its response to the conflict with Hamas. Biden has publicly expressed his support for Israel and promised to have its back, but he is also paying attention to the plight of the Palestinians and the potential consequences of an aggressive Israeli response. During his visit to Tel Aviv, Biden asked Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tough questions about his strategy and emphasized the need for Israel to operate by the laws of war and protect civilians. Biden is under pressure from Arab leaders, European officials, and members of his own party to seek a balanced approach that protects both Israeli and Palestinian civilians and promotes long-lasting peace. The situation on the ground is becoming more complicated, with warnings of escalation against U.S. forces by Iranian proxies, and a catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. Biden has faced criticism from some members of his party for what they perceive as a double standard in valuing the lives of Israelis over Palestinians. There has been debate within the administration over whether Biden's policy is too closely aligned with Israel's, and at least one State Department official resigned, citing a one-sided policy that favors Israel at the expense of the Palestinians. Other officials have expressed similar concerns in internal discussions. During his visit to Israel, Biden secured an agreement with Egypt and Israel to allow a limited amount of aid into Gaza via the Rafah border crossing, which was seen as a significant concession from Israel. However, there are reports that Israeli officials were opposed to providing any assistance to Gazans and expressed intense anguish, anger, and hostility toward Palestinians in Gaza. Biden and his top aides also heard deep anguish from some Israeli officials during private talks. Biden compared the assault on Israel to the 9/11 attacks and urged the Israelis not to be consumed by rage. The American center's embrace of the far-right fuels Israel's war machine. Al Jazeera. In this opinion piece, author A.B. Wilkinson argues that U.S. President Joe Biden's recent visit to Israel and his rhetoric in support of the Israeli government's actions in the Gaza Strip reflect a U.S. foreign policy that consistently supports oppressive regimes. Wilkinson criticizes the bipartisan consensus between the center-right and far-right in the U.S. when it comes to relations with such regimes. The author points out that the U.S. has a history of settler colonialism and genocide, making its support for Israel's actions in Palestine unsurprising. Wilkinson goes on to argue that the dominant center-right and far-right attitudes in American society are reflected in opinion polls that show greater sympathy for Israel than for the Palestinians. The author suggests that the center-right's support for far-right causes has harmed social justice movements in the U.S. Wilkinson calls for a radical approach to end Israel's oppressive policies in Palestine, including divestment from Israel and the imposition of embargoes. The author concludes by stating that a ceasefire in Gaza is not enough to stop the bloodshed, and that a radical approach is needed for a path to peace in Palestine and Israel. Wilkinson argues that the U.S. center-right must break with the far-right and support measures that put pressure on Israel to change its policies. Only then, the author suggests, can there be a true celebration of life and peace in the region. Canada has new security body tailor-made to discuss perilous world events. So why isn't it meeting? The Toronto Star. The Canadian government should utilize its National Security Council, a cabinet committee chaired by the Prime Minister, to address the recent conflict between Israel and Hamas, according to Wesley Wark, a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. The National Security Council was established last month to address pressing security issues, and Wark argues that the conflict in the Middle East is an ideal opportunity for the Council to utilize its intelligence and decision-making capacity. The Council could help the government assess intelligence about the recent bombing of a hospital compound in Gaza, determine responsibility for the attack, and navigate the political fallout. Tim Scott says he'd vote against Ukraine-Israel package in its current construct. Yahoo! Senator Tim Scott, Republican South Carolina, has said he will vote against the White House's emergency funding request for further aid to Ukraine and Israel, arguing that the package should be separated to allow for quicker aid to Israel. Scott says that Israel is at the beginning of a long protracted war, and that the U.S. should focus its attention immediately on Israel. The White House asked Congress for roughly $100 billion in emergency funding on Friday to provide additional money for border security, allies in the Indo-Pacific, and for Israel and Ukraine, respectively. How Biden is continuing to cancel student loan debt despite Supreme Court ruling. CNN. The Biden administration has canceled more than $48 billion of student loan debt since June 2022 through existing federal student loan forgiveness programs that target specific categories of borrowers. These programs are separate from the rejected loan forgiveness plan, which would have canceled about $430 billion of the $1.6 trillion of outstanding federal student loan debt all at once. The Biden administration has been granting student loan forgiveness through these existing programs on a rolling basis since coming into office, and has discharged a total of $127 billion for nearly 3.6 million people to date. The actions draw a stark contrast with the Trump administration, which tried to limit some of these forgiveness programs and slowed the processing of some applications. However, Biden's Republican critics say that at least some of his debt relief actions are illegal, and are an attempt to circumvent the Supreme Court's ruling. U.S. to further increase military presence to bolster deterrence in Middle East. Yahoo! The U.S. plans to increase its military presence in the Middle East in response to escalating tensions with Iran and its proxy forces in the region. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin announced that the U.S. will bolster regional deterrence efforts, increase force protection for U.S. forces, and assist in the defense of Israel. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Strike Group will join the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group in the Eastern Mediterranean, while a Terminal High-Altitude Area Defense Battery and additional Patriot battalions will be deployed to increase force protection. The U.S. has vowed to support Israel in its conflict with Hamas, and President Biden is set to request additional funding from Congress for both Israel and Ukraine. South Korea, U.S. and Japan hold first-ever trilateral aerial exercise in face of North Korean threats. The Toronto Star. The South Korean, U.S., and Japanese militaries conducted their first-ever trilateral aerial exercise in response to North Korean nuclear threats. The exercise involved a nuclear-capable B-52 bomber from the United States and fighter jets from South Korea and Japan. South Korea and Japan are both key U.S. allies in Asia, and the three countries have agreed to increase defense cooperation and boost their joint response capabilities against North Korean threats. The drill could draw a furious response from North Korea, which has long criticized U.S. training exercises with South Korea, and has openly threatened to use nuclear weapons in potential conflicts with the U.S. and South Korea. Where do 7 states' investigations stand? The Guardian. Multiple states are still investigating a scheme created by Trump allies to cast fake electoral votes for the Republican candidate in the 2020 election. 7 states that Trump lost saw slates of fake GOP electors falsely claim that Trump had won their electoral votes. 2 prosecutors in Michigan and Georgia have already filed charges against fake electors, while others have confirmed investigations but provided few details. The scheme had no precedent, making it difficult for states and experts to determine which laws may have been broken and whether the charges should be state or federal. At the federal level, Special Counsel Jack Smith and his team have brought charges against Trump and his allies over their attempts to overturn the 2020 election results, including the fake elector scheme. Americans back Israel but are wary of getting pulled into conflict. Wall Street Journal. A recent poll conducted by the Wall Street Journal and Ipsos shows that while U.S. public opinion is rallying behind Israel in response to the deadly attacks by Hamas, the American appetite for a role in the war is limited. The poll found that 42% of respondents believe the U.S. should side with Israel, while only 3% believe the U.S. should take the Palestinian side. The survey also found that Americans are increasingly supportive of Israel compared to prior surveys, although support is much higher among older Americans than among young people. 52% of respondents said the U.S. should not back either Israel or Palestine in their long-running conflict, and only 38% said the U.S. should commit American troops to help Israel if it is attacked by its neighbors. The survey found that Americans feel less warmly towards Palestinians than Israelis, with only 50% holding a favorable view of Palestinians, compared to 75% who held a favorable view of Israelis. This survey suggests that President Biden is largely in step with American public opinion in offering moral support to Israel, but falls short of suggesting further military intervention in the region. Vivek Ramaswamy in Iowa campaign stops opposes aid package for Ukraine, Israel. Yahoo! Vivek Ramaswamy, a Republican presidential candidate, has urged lawmakers to reject President Joe Biden's proposed $100 billion aid package to Israel and Ukraine. Ramaswamy has previously opposed aid to Ukraine, and has now expressed concerns over Israel's response to Hamas attacks, warning that a ground conflict could ensue. Ramaswamy has stated that the U.S. should provide Israel with diplomatic support, intelligence and munitions, but does not believe that an Israeli assault on Gaza will help. He has also called for ending U.S. financial support for Israel. Ramaswamy has argued that Israel must clarify its objectives and what U.S. support is expected, warning that a ground invasion of Gaza without a clear objective would be disastrous. Several other Republican presidential candidates, including Nikki Haley and Mike Pence, have expressed strong support for Israel. Gavin Newsom's Hong Kong travel plan draws bipartisan fire. Yahoo! California Governor Gavin Newsom arrived in Hong Kong on Sunday after a trip to Israel, and will continue on to Beijing, Shenzhen, Guangzhou and Shanghai. Newsom's visit is focused on building closer climate ties in areas like air quality, offshore wind and cap-and trade. Newsom is a key surrogate for President Joe Biden's re-election, and the White House has approved the trip. However, over 50 U.S.-based pro-democracy and human rights organizations have criticized Newsom for sidelining human rights during the visit. Critics argue that Newsom's singular focus on climate issues sets a problematic tone for future diplomatic engagement that benefits the territory's sanctioned leaders. Neil Thomas, a fellow for Chinese politics at the Asia Society, points out that Joe Biden has indicated that Hong Kong Chief Executive John Lee Ka-chiu will not be allowed to enter the U.S. to attend a gathering in San Francisco next month. The trial of 47 pro-democracy community workers, activists, and legislators prosecuted under Hong Kong's national security law is ongoing, and the Hong Kong government has issued warrants for 8 self-exiled Hong Kong pro-democracy activists for alleged collusion with a foreign country. Column: Biden says the U.S. must help Israel and Ukraine succeed, he's staking his reputation on it. Yahoo! U.S. President Joe Biden said on June 3 that he aims to ensure the success of Ukraine and Israel. The president's comments came as he requested $105 billion in emergency funding from Congress. Most of the funding would go to Ukraine, while substantial amounts would be allocated to Israel and Taiwan. The request is part of Biden's efforts to push back against increasing sentiment among U.S. voters, particularly Republicans, that the U.S. should decrease its foreign commitments. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Six, your resident observer from the six-dimensional world. Today, we have covered a wide range of news stories, from the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas to the U.S. response, as well as other international developments. Let's dive into a deeper analysis of these stories. In the Israel-Gaza conflict, we see Israel facing a difficult decision on whether to proceed with a ground invasion or continue negotiations for the release of hostages. This dilemma puts Israel in a challenging position, as a ground operation may lead to higher casualties and increased international pressure. Additionally, there is the risk of a second front with Hezbollah if they choose to attack while Israel is engaged against Hamas. The U.S. has expressed its readiness to respond if American forces are targeted in the conflict, highlighting the potential escalation. Moving on to the U.S. political landscape, we see Senator Tim Scott defending his previous comments that President Biden has blood on his hands due to the White House's prisoner swap with Iran. This highlights the ongoing debate between Republicans and Democrats over U.S. foreign policy decisions. Additionally, U.S. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has labeled China, Russia, and Iran as the new axis of evil, reflecting growing tensions in international relations. In terms of diplomacy, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's upcoming visits to the U.S., China, and the Cook Islands aim to strengthen Australia's alliance with the U.S. and improve relations with China. These visits come at a crucial time when global powers are repositioning themselves in the face of geopolitical challenges. As for international military exercises, South Korea, the U.S., and Japan have conducted their first-ever trilateral aerial exercise in response to North Korean nuclear threats. This demonstrates the increasing cooperation between these countries to counter regional security challenges. Regarding domestic U.S. issues, we see continued investigations into the scheme created by Trump allies to cast fake electoral votes in the 2020 election. States are grappling with the legal implications of this unprecedented scheme and determining which charges should be brought, if any. On a different note, the Biden administration continues to cancel student loan debt through existing federal forgiveness programs, despite facing criticism from Republican opponents who argue that these actions are illegal. Lastly, a recent poll shows that while U.S. public opinion is rallying behind Israel, Americans are wary of getting involved in the conflict. This sentiment aligns with President Biden's approach of offering moral support to Israel without committing further military intervention. In conclusion, these news stories paint a complex picture of international relations, domestic politics, and ongoing conflicts. It's essential to consider multiple perspectives and analyze the potential consequences of various actions. As always, I encourage you, our viewers, to share your thoughts and engage in the discussion. What are your perspectives on these stories? Let's continue to explore and learn together. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.